Look at them. They are the picture of perfection. Young, beautiful, wealthy, and in love. The Canadian press nicknamed them Ken and Barbie because they looked like plastic dolls come to life. But behind the closed doors of their pastel pink house, Bernardo and Karla Homolka weren't playing house. They were filming a nightmare. They were capturing their crimes on videotape, a library of torture that would eventually prove that the beautiful bride wasn't a helpless victim. She was a monster. In 1993, Canadian prosecutors made a deal. They believed Karla Homolka was a battered wife, forced to watch her husband kill. They gave her the deal of the century. Just 12 years in prison in exchange for testifying against him. 6 months later, police found the tapes hidden in a bathroom ceiling. And they realized they had made a terrible mistake. The tapes didn't show a victim with a gun to her head. They showed an active, willing participant laughing during the crimes. But the ink was already dry. The government had just accidentally sanctioned a serial killer. Psychologists call it Folie, a Deux madness. It is a rare phenomenon where two people feed off each other's delusions, escalating violence further than either would go alone. Bernardo was the predator, but Karla Homolka was the bait. He had the urge to kill, but she gave him the access. Together, they became the most hated couple in Canadian history. This is the story of how love turned lethal. The early 1990s in Ontario, Canada, was a time of innocence. People left their doors unlocked. Teenagers walked home from school alone. But that innocence was shattered by a couple who lived in a pastel pink house on Bayview Drive. Bernardo and Karla Homolka seemed to have it all. He was a wealthy accountant. She was a stunning veterinary assistant. They were the couple everyone wanted to be, the Canadian dream personified. But beneath the surface, they were concealing a dynamic of sadism and sexual depravity that is almost impossible to comprehend. Together, they abducted, tortured, and murdered 3 innocent girls, including Karla's own teenage sister. Welcome to Hidden Killers. Today, we are opening the case file on the Ken and Barbie Killers. We are going to analyze the toxic psychology of their relationship, the controversial deal with the devil that let Karla walk free, and the discovery of the videotapes that proved evil doesn't always look like a monster. Warning: this story involves details of extreme violence and sexual assault. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. In the late 1980s, the Scarborough suburb of Toronto was a place of affluence and ambition. Into this world stepped Bernardo and Karla Homolka. On the surface, they were the embodiment of the yuppie dream. Paul was a 23-year-old accountant who exuded confidence. He drove a flashy gold Nissan 240SX with the vanity plate, Tequila. He wore tailored suits, obsessed over his appearance, and charmed everyone he met. He was a narcissist of the highest order, but his charisma was blinding. Karla was 17, blonde, beautiful, and working as a veterinary assistant. When they met at a convention in 1987, the attraction was immediate. To their friends and families, they were the golden couple. They were nicknamed Ken and Barbie because they looked flawless like plastic dolls come to life. But the dynamic behind closed doors was far from perfect. It was predatory. Bernardo didn't just want a wife. He wanted a possession. He famously told his friends that he was looking for a blonde, blue-eyed virgin whom he could mold into his ideal woman. Karla fit the physical description, but she was also desperate for love and status. Paul began a process of systematic grooming. He slowly introduced deviance into their relationship, pushing Karla's boundaries bit by bit. He controlled what she wore, who she spoke to, and how she acted. Karla, terrified of losing the perfect man, complied. She began to shapeshift into whatever Paul wanted her to be. This wasn't a partnership of equals. It was a master and a servant, wrapped in the guise of a fairy tale romance. The foundation of their relationship wasn't love. It was a shared growing darkness that they hid from the world behind bright smiles and expensive clothes. While Paul was playing the role of the doting fiancé by day, he was living a terrifying double life by night. Long before he began killing, Paul Bernardo was already one of Canada's most prolific sexual predators. Between 1987 and 1990, the streets of Scarborough were haunted by a phantom known as the Scarborough Rapist. Paul's MO was meticulous and chilling. He treated rape like a tactical operation. He would stalk neighborhoods for weeks, learning the schedules of women who lived alone or waiting for husbands to leave for night shifts. He would unscrew porch lights to ensure darkness. He would break in, wearing a mask, and terrorize his victims in their own beds. He attacked nearly 20 women. The police were baffled. Paul was so arrogant that he even approached police officers at coffee shops to chat about the case, fishing for information on how close they were to catching him. He got a thrill from the duplicity. He loved knowing something the rest of the world didn't. Eventually, Paul confessed his secret life to Karla. This was the moment where a normal person would have fled. A normal person would have called the police. But Karla Homolka didn't run. Instead, she validated him. She accepted his crimes as a quirk of his personality. By keeping his secret, she became his accomplice. This acceptance was the fuel Paul needed to escalate. He realized that with Karla by his side, he didn't just have to be a rapist in the shadows. He could bring his darkness home. In June 1991, Paul and Karla were married in a fairy tale ceremony. It was the social event of the season for their circle. But beneath the white lace and the vows of "till death do us part," a sinister pact had been formed. Psychologists refer to this dynamic as Folie, a deux-shared madness. It is a rare phenomenon where a dominant partner, Paul, imposes their delusions and violent desires on a submissive partner, Karla, who then adopts them as her own. Tammy was 15, innocent and trusting. Paul badgered Karla about her constantly. He manipulated Karla, telling her that if he could just have Tammy, his urges would be satisfied and he would be a faithful husband. Karla, twisted by her desperation to keep Paul, agreed. It is a betrayal so profound it defies understanding. Karla agreed to sacrifice her own baby sister to her husband as a wedding present. They began to plan. They weren't just a married couple anymore. They were a hunting party. The wedding wasn't a celebration of love. It was the sealing of a blood pact. The Ken and Barbie mask was firmly in place, but underneath, the plastic was melting. The nightmare began on December 23, 1992, days before Christmas. The Homolka family was preparing for the holidays. Paul and Karla invited Tammy down to the basement rec room to hang out, drink, and celebrate. Tammy looked up to her big sister and her cool new brother-in-law. She had no idea she was walking into a trap. Paul and Karla had prepared a cocktail spiked with halcyon, a powerful animal tranquilizer that Karla had stolen from the veterinary clinic where she worked. They gave the drink to Tammy. As the drugs took hold, Tammy lost consciousness. Paul proceeded to assault her while Karla watched and assisted. But then, the plan went wrong. Tammy's body reacted to the massive dose of drugs and alcohol. She began to vomit while she was unconscious. Because she was sedated, her gag reflex didn't work. She aspirated the vomit and began to choke. Instead of calling 911 to save her sister, Karla focused on protecting Paul. They cleaned up the scene. They removed evidence of the assault. By the time help was called, Tammy Homolka was dead. The coroner, unaware of the halcyon, ruled the death an accident, aspiration of vomit due to alcohol consumption. Paul and Karla had killed Karla's sister and gotten away with it. But rather than being horrified, the couple was emboldened. They had crossed the line from sexual assault to homicide, and the bond between them solidified in blood. With Tammy gone, Paul's urges returned, stronger than ever. The accident hadn't satisfied him. It had only whetted his appetite. In June 1991, they decided to hunt a stranger. Leslie Mahaffy was a 14-year-old girl living a normal teenage life. On a Friday night, she had missed her curfew after a funeral and was locked out of her house. She was standing in her driveway, crying, afraid of getting in trouble with her parents. Paul and Karla drove by. Seeing a vulnerable girl, Karla jumped out of the car. She used her non-threatening appearance, a pretty, concerned woman, to lure Leslie. "Do you need a ride?" she asked. Leslie got in. They took her back to their pink house in St. Catharines. This was the beginning of the Bernardo tapes. Paul set up a video camera on a tripod. He didn't just want to commit the crime. He wanted to star in it. He wanted to rewatch it. For 24 hours, Leslie was held captive in their bedroom. She was terrorized, assaulted, and forced to beg for her life while the camera rolled. Karla was not a bystander. She was an active participant, helping to restrain the girl and following Paul's directions. When they were done, Paul strangled Leslie with a ligature. To dispose of the body, he dismembered her, encased her remains in concrete blocks, and dumped them in Lake Gibson. The Ken and Barbie Killers had evolved into butchers. The disappearance of Leslie Mahaffy terrified the community, but Paul and Karla were arrogant. They struck again less than a year later, on Easter weekend, 1992. Kristen French was 15 years old, a student at Holy Cross Secondary School. She was walking home from school when a gold car pulled up alongside her. Paul and Karla were inside. Karla held a map out the window, pretending to be lost. She waved Kristen over. Being a polite girl, Kristen stepped forward to help. In seconds, Paul shoved her into the back seat, and they sped off. Kristen was held captive for 3 days. But the tapes of her captivity reveal something extraordinary. Despite the horror, despite the drugs, Kristen French refused to be broken. In one of the few moments described by prosecutors, Kristen told Paul, "I don't know how your wife can stand you." Later, when faced with death, she said, "Some things are worth dying for." Paul and Karla forced her to endure unspeakable acts for the camera. Karla later claimed she was forced to participate, but the tapes tell a different story. They show Karla laughing, adjusting the lighting, and even complaining about domestic chores while a dying girl lay bound in the next room. On Easter Sunday, they drove Kristen to a remote side road and murdered her. They left her body in a ditch, unaware that forensic science was about to catch up with them. The Green Ribbon Task Force was hunting a monster, but they were looking for a lone drifter, not a suburban accountant. However, Paul Bernard's arrogance was his downfall. He had refused to provide a DNA sample during a dragnet of Scarborough rapist suspects, which put him on a watch list. But the real break came from inside the pink house. The toxicity of Paul and Karla's relationship began to implode. Paul became increasingly abusive toward Karla, beating her frequently. By late 1992, Karla realized that she was no longer his partner. She was a liability. She feared she would be his next victim. In January 1993, after a brutal beating with a heavy-duty flashlight, Karla left him. She went to the hospital and then to the police. She told them everything, or at least her version of everything. She painted herself as a battered wife, a hostage in her own home who's forced to watch her husband kill. Simultaneously, forensic scientists matched Paul's DNA to the Scarborough rapes. The police arrested Paul Bernardo. The golden couple was destroyed. But now, the legal system had to decide what to do with the wife. The Crown prosecutors were in a difficult position. They had Paul Bernardo in custody, but they lacked direct physical evidence linking him to the murders of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen French. They needed a witness. They needed Karla. Karla's lawyers played a masterful game. They presented Karla as a victim of battered woman syndrome. They argued she was terrified, brainwashed, and acted only under duress, literally with a gun to her head. Without the videotapes, which were still missing, the police had no way to disprove her story. In May 1993, the prosecutors signed what became known as the deal with the devil. In exchange for her testimony against Paul, Karla Homolka would plead guilty to manslaughter, not murder, and receive a fixed sentence of only 12 years. It was an incredibly light sentence for someone involved in 3 murders. The public was skeptical, but the Crown felt it was necessary to secure a conviction against Paul. They signed the deal. The ink dried, and then the truth surfaced. Paul Bernardo had hidden the videotapes of the crimes inside the ceiling of his bathroom. After his arrest, his original lawyer, Ken Murray, went to the house, retrieved the tapes, and kept them for over a year, unsure of what to do with such radioactive evidence. When the tapes were finally turned over to the police and prosecutors, Karla's plea deal had already been signed. The prosecutors gathered to watch the footage. They expected to see a terrified Karla being forced to participate at gunpoint. What they saw made them sick. The tapes showed Karla Homolka not as a victim, but as an enthusiastic partner. She wasn't crying. She was smiling. She wasn't being forced. She was giving instructions. She called Paul king. She drugged the girls. She taunted them. The tapes proved that Karla had lied about almost everything. She was just as culpable as Paul, but it was too late. The deal was legally binding. They could not revoke it. They had accidentally given a serial killer a get-out-of-jail-free card. The tapes became the centerpiece of Paul's trial, proving his guilt, but they also cemented Karla's legacy as the most hated woman in Canada. In 1995, Paul Bernardo was declared a dangerous offender and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. He remains in maximum security today, a pariah even among other prisoners. But Karla's story ended differently. In 2005, her 12-year sentence expired. She was released. The outrage was palpable. Protests erupted across the country. Restrictions were placed on her movement. But she was a free woman. Karla changed her name. She moved to the Caribbean, then returned to Quebec. She got married. She had 3 children. Today, the woman who handed her own sister over to a killer lives a quiet life in the suburbs. She volunteers at her children's school. She shops at the grocery store. The pink house in St. Catharines was demolished and replaced, an attempt to erase the physical memory of the crimes. But the psychological scar remains. The case of the Ken and Barbie Killers exposed the flaws in the justice system and proved that evil can hide behind a pretty face. One monster is locked away forever. The other walks among us. The house is gone. The city demolished it to erase the stain of what happened there. But the scars left by the Barbie and Ken killers will never fade. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka proved that evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it lives in the pastel house next door. Sometimes it drives a nice car. And sometimes it wears a wedding dress. But the hardest pill to swallow isn't the crimes themselves. It's the aftermath. One monster will die in a cage. The other is a free woman, a mother, living among us. The tapes proved her guilt, but the law proved its limitations. Now I want to turn this over to you. The prosecutors argued they needed the deal with the devil to ensure Paul was caught. But knowing what we know now about the tapes... Was it worth letting Karla walk free? Let me know your verdict in the comments. If this deep dive into the darkness was compelling, please hit the like button and subscribe. We investigate the stories the world tries to forget. Stay safe. And be careful who you trust.